da parte do Rogério. Depois. Então, vamos ter, em sequência, nós vamos ter o autor do livro. Você me presta, por favor. Deste livro aqui, A New Bretton Woods, The Case for a New Bretton Woods, professor Richard Kozul Wright. Esse livro vai ser lançado mais tarde, em seguida. Então, nós vamos ter em sequência a professora Ariane, professor Antônio Boinain e o professor Kozul Wright. E depois nós vamos ter comentários, então, do Rogério Estudos, da Esther Dweck também. Ok? Então, vamos começar com a professora Ariane sobre as cidades inteligentes e sustentáveis. Se a gente lembrar daquelas 3 áreas que foram colocadas no vídeo do professor Jot, né, a mobilidade, né, a energia e a comida, nós temos aqui um pouco da mobilidade, um pouco talvez da comida, né, com a comida, né?
Bom, boa tarde, pessoal. Eu vou pedir licença para ficar de pé, que eu acho que eu prefiro se vocês não se incomodarem. Bom, boa tarde a todos, um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Sou professora e pesquisadora do CUPEAD, também estou na Superintendência de Pesquisa da Pró-Reitoria de Pós-Graduação e Pesquisa da UFRJ. Hoje eu estou aqui um pouquinho na dupla função, com os 2 chapéus. Primeiro eu vou falar um pouquinho da pesquisa que a gente tem desenvolvido lá no Instituto. E, para finalizar, algumas ações que a gente tem feito também nessa temática dentro da Pró-Reitoria, em parceria com o Parque Tecnológico da UFRJ. Tá? Então, tem um pouco esse viés a minha fala. Bom, eu preparei algumas provocações aqui, na verdade, né? Não é bem uma palestra, não é bem o propósito, que acho que a ideia é a gente discutir, né? Que amanhãs desejamos, quais são as transformações que a gente está vivenciando. E a minha proposta hoje aqui é pensar um pouco o papel das cidades nesse processo de transformação. Então, quando a gente fala de cidades inteligentes e sustentáveis, vem muitas coisas na cabeça, inclusive esse conceito mega adjetivado, né, que é uma cidade inteligente. Então, nós vamos discutir um pouquinho sobre isso. Então, o objetivo da minha fala aqui é explorar a questão das cidades, mas com um foco nesse desenvolvimento mais abrangente, né, pensando o lado econômico, social, a questão da sustentabilidade, sobretudo pensando a questão do ser humano como centro, né, como centro desse bem-estar social e da qualidade de vida das pessoas. Qual é a grande questão aqui que eu coloquei? Por que as cidades, né, aparecem dentro dessa discussão de hoje aqui que eu estou propondo para vocês? Que cidades a gente tem no século XXI e que cidades queremos para o século XXI? Acho que são 2 questões aí que as cidades, praticamente hoje, é onde se vive, né? Nós estamos aqui numa cidade cheia de problemas e também de soluções. É na cidade que a gente vive, na cidade que a gente desenvolve nossas atividades cotidianas. E isso tende a aumentar ainda mais, né, as estimativas da ONU de que a população mundial ela vai crescer ainda mais no âmbito das cidades, ou seja, até 2030 a gente vai ter 60% da população mundial vivendo nas cidades. Então, por isso a ideia de falar das cidades como amanhãs desejáveis. Que cidades queremos, que cidades estamos projetando e que cidade temos, né? Então, a ideia hoje também é discutir que tipo de cidade nós temos, que espaços urbanos nós vivemos e quais são os principais problemas que eles nos provocam. Uma das coisas aí interessantes quando a gente está pensando na concepção de cidades inteligentes é a questão das cidades projetadas, né, ou das cidades showroom. Não sei se vocês têm acompanhado a discussão sobre esse assunto, mas um dos tópicos principais aí, quando começa essa noção de cidade inteligente, a ideia do Smart City, ela vem muito atrelada a algumas empresas de tecnologia, IBM, sobretudo, que vem inserir esse conceito como princípio mercadológico, no sentido de oferecer soluções tecnológicas para a gestão pública, para a cidade, como uma espécie de mercadoria. Então, esse conceito, ele nasce de forma muito criticada. Ele vem para a academia de forma muito criticada, de forma muito pejorativa. Mas não parou por aí, né? Esse conceito, ele vem avançando e é por aí um pouco que eu vou refletir com vocês. Mas um dos resultados que nós temos prático a respeito dessa discussão de Smart City numa perspectiva mais tecnológica são as cidades showroom. Aqui a gente tem um exemplo de cidade altamente projetada para ser a cidade do século XXI, mas é uma cidade que foi extremamente cara, né, em termos de... Então, a cidade de zero carbono custou aproximadamente 22 bilhões de dólares, mas possui apenas cerca de 300 habitantes. O que essa cidade ela tem, né, de diferencial? Ela é toda projetada, ela é basicamente, não sei se vocês conhecem, né, se vocês já ouviram falar desse caso, ele é muito emblemático para a discussão de cidades inteligentes. Então, é 100% sustentável, voltada para pedestres, basicamente... Todo o transporte público é passado por meio do subsolo, ou seja, a cidade toda projetada para que ela tenha calçadas agradáveis, tamanho adequado de sombra, mas ela custou 22 bilhões e serve para 300 pessoas, habitantes que moram nela. Então, uma das coisas que isso leva a questionar para quem são essas cidades inteligentes, né? Ou seja, em que medida essas cidades inteligentes estão respondendo, de fato, às transformações do novo século. E aí eu coloquei para vocês aqui um pouquinho dessa discussão. Eu estou atrapalhando vocês, né? Desculpa, eu vou tentar falar sentada, é coisa de italiano. Mas, enfim, qual que é o significado de cidade inteligente? Como eu falei para vocês, inicialmente ela tem então essa característica mais mercadológica, vindo muito associada à tecnologia e às empresas, e depois ela entra na academia, né, esse debate de cidades inteligentes, ela entra na academia e é um conceito hoje em amadurecimento. Tanto é que hoje eu propus aqui para vocês discutirem esse assunto, porque dos 17 objetivos de desenvolvimento sustentável da ONU, o objetivo 11 fala de cidades sustentáveis, né? Não fala exatamente a palavra cidades inteligentes, mas está trabalhando com esse conceito. Então, a academia tem trabalhado de forma a tornar esse conceito mais abrangente, capturando elementos que não estavam previstos no conceito original. Então, até coloquei uma pergunta aqui, provocadora, né? O que é cidade inteligente? É um adjetivo da cidade? É um princípio mercadológico ou é um conceito em amadurecimento? Eu acho que isso é uma grande reflexão. Fazendo algumas pesquisas bibliométricas, recentemente a gente vê que é um conceito que ainda não está sedimentado. Há, por exemplo, na academia, diversos frameworks sendo produzidos para traduzir esse conceito, o que é muito complicado para quem está querendo operacionalizar esse conceito. Sob o ponto de vista de mercado, também é muito complicado, muitas consultorias oferecendo serviços para cidades inteligentes, empresas com conceitos diversos. Então, hoje, para quem vai fazer pesquisa e produzir pesquisa na área, é uma seara muito complexa de lidar, exatamente porque esse conceito não está, de fato, amadurecido e tampouco há um consenso sobre ele. Bom, trazendo aqui para a nossa realidade, que eu acho que é a provocação que eu quero trazer aqui, é pensar a realidade de cidades inteligentes a partir da perspectiva do sul global. Né? As cidades inteligentes, assim como ele vem oriundo, esse conceito vem oriundo de empresas, também vem oriundo das cidades do norte. Né? Isso significa que o que está se pensando em termos de cidades inteligentes nos países, principalmente cidades médias europeias, é muito diferente do que a gente vai pensar para cidades latino-americanas. Né? Como falar de cidade inteligente no Rio de Janeiro, que é um dos conceitos que hoje adjetiva a nossa cidade maravilhosa aqui, se ao lado a gente está vendo questões tão problemáticas, essenciais de saneamento, enfim, como que a gente consegue traduzir a noção de inteligente para uma cidade com realidades tão díspares e tão diferentes também das oriundas do norte global. Aqui só para vocês, imagino, não sei se vocês estão acompanhando essa discussão política, no âmbito do Congresso Nacional existe uma proposta de uma política macro orientadora de cidades inteligentes, para dar macro-diretrizes para cidades inteligentes brasileiras. É uma política que ainda está em processo de tramitação, então ela não está aprovada, mas é um documento bastante rico, né? Foi bastante discutido. É um documento interessante que traz essa noção de cidade inteligente no formato ampliado do conceito, que pressupõe inclusão, sustentabilidade, responsabilidade, e que serve, ou que quer servir como diretriz para as cidades brasileiras seguir isso como norte. Provavelmente, se isso for aprovado, vai haver políticas públicas nessa direção, no sentido de incentivar o processo de transformação das cidades, né, num local mais aceitável, aceitável do seu ponto de vista do bem-estar, mais humano, mais inclusivo, mais responsável do seu ponto de vista ambiental. Também coloquei algumas definições aí no âmbito do BID. E tem também, eu não sei se também, eu vou falar aqui, mas estou falando para um público extremamente qualificado, certamente já estão antenados com tudo isso. Eu vou passar aqui mais adiante, depois eu volto. Tem as cidades inteligentes, ela tem ISO própria, né? Ou seja, tem um sistema de normatização que já foi, hoje ela é voluntária, né? No sentido de que nenhuma cidade ela é obrigada, obviamente, a seguir as normas de padrões das cidades inteligentes, mas existe já uma iniciativa que foi anunciada recentemente, a cidade de São José dos Campos, como uma das cidades, a primeira cidade certificada como cidade inteligente do Brasil. Esse processo, eu busquei saber, ele ainda é um processo em maturação, está sendo feito em cooperação com a ABNT, então é um movimento que possivelmente deve crescer no Brasil, né? E, obviamente, eu acho que a gente tem que refletir sobre isso, o que significa, porque uma das coisas mais complexas, principalmente quem está mais de olho nesse assunto, o que nós estamos entendendo como cidades inteligentes, e que tipo de cidade será certificado, e que tipo de projeto será certificado, para onde nós estamos direcionando as nossas cidades, o local onde a gente vive, e a gente realiza o nosso cotidiano. Então, esse é um assunto que a gente não pode deixar passar, é um assunto extremamente pertinente e que está no meio, no cerne da Agenda 2030. Vou voltar aqui, obviamente, falando de Rio de Janeiro, como eu falei para vocês. Rio de Janeiro é uma das cidades que tem ganhado premiações, tem estado nos rankings de cidades inteligentes mundo afora. E, a despeito disso, existe a iniciativa, obviamente, bastante premiada do Qual, né? Do Centro de Operações do Rio de Janeiro, como uma iniciativa de integração de políticas públicas. Lá, não sei se vocês tiveram a possibilidade de visitar, professor Manuel Heitor, se não foi visitar o Centro de Operações, acho que já, né? Mas é uma visita para todos, que todos devem fazer. Realmente é um projeto bastante interessante, integrador, para pensar a política pública em cima de dados integrados. No entanto, obviamente, isso não traduz a cidade do Rio de Janeiro como uma cidade inteligente. Exige um projeto muito mais articulado, muito mais macro e que desenvolve outras, para desenvolver a cidade do Rio de Janeiro como um todo. Então, uma questão que eu tenho refletido aí nas pesquisas que eu tenho desenvolvido é em que medida a cidade inteligente também exclui. Né, à medida que você coloca a tecnologia como um centro do processo de transformação dessas cidades, em que medida essa tecnologia ela é inclusiva ou ela tem excluído. Né? Eu acho que essa é uma reflexão muito pertinente que a gente não pode deixar passar desapercebido. E aí tem outros tantos projetos bastante sofisticados, acho que o professor Manuel Heitor trouxe aqui, eu fico muito sempre de olho no que ele tem dito, né? Eu estava na banca do Leonardo junto com... Porque realmente são projetos de cidades inteligentes, projetos de futuro, projetos que vão alçar um novo contexto, mas desarticulado eles significam muito pouco. É isso que eu gostaria de trazer aqui para vocês. Bom, aí é essa questão que eu apontei desde o início, né, que é a provocação que eu queria trazer para vocês. Eu escolhi uma foto aqui muito emblemática, eu acho, Mas poderia ser tantas outras. Eu fiquei em dúvida de tantas que eu tinha para colocar, qual eu colocaria. Né? Que cidade inteligente nós estamos falando, né? Ao mesmo tempo que a gente tem tecnologias altamente sofisticadas, tentando solucionar problemas reais e importantes para o nosso futuro enquanto humanidade, nós temos problemas reais que estão à nossa porta e que realmente a gente não consegue solucionar. Que, a princípio ou aparentemente poderia ser bem mais simples do que as soluções tecnológicas altamente sofisticadas que têm sido ofertada pelo mercado. Então, nesse sentido, é com base nisso que a gente tem desenvolvido, como eu falei para vocês, que eu ia entrar aqui um pouquinho na pesquisa que eu desenvolvo, a gente tem desenvolvido essa reflexão lá no âmbito do nosso grupo de pesquisa de pensar cidades inteligentes dentro de um contexto das cidades latino-americanas, que têm suas peculiaridades, que têm os seus problemas que são reais e muito díspares em relação aos demais modelos que existem hoje, que são predominantes na academia. Então, aí eu coloquei aqui um modelinho que a gente desenvolveu, obviamente que ele é muito simplificador, ele foi publicado na revista Cities. Depois, se quiserem, eu posso passar a referência como um todo. A gente traz uma série de indicadores aí para pensar a realidade das cidades latino-americanas a partir dessas necessidades que são idiosincráticas em relação às cidades do norte global. E aí, já tentando ir para uma... Antes de passar, deixa eu só vou avançar aqui para não entrar numa outra pauta. Ainda sobre a questão da agenda de pesquisa, empiricamente, além da gente ter desenvolvido alguns modelos pensando a realidade latino-americana, o que a gente tem feito, do seu ponto de vista empírico, lá no nosso grupo de pesquisa? Hoje, o nosso grupo tem mapeado as iniciativas de cidades inteligentes no estado do Rio de Janeiro. Então, hoje, a gente tem um mapa de cidades, a gente tem um mapa do estado do Rio de Janeiro. Desse mapa do estado do Rio de Janeiro, a gente tem as cidades que têm alguma iniciativa em cidades inteligentes e até a gente tem um mapa gradativo daquelas cidades que colocam no seu planejamento estratégico se tornarem cidades inteligentes e que já tem um plano integrado de cidades inteligentes. Então, hoje a gente está para lançar um painel, né, que chama painel de gestão local, com esses dados publicizados, né, para que todos possam conhecer como o estado do Rio de Janeiro tem se mobilizado em relação a esse assunto e as cidades. Só antecipando um pouquinho os resultados, eles não são promissores, no sentido de que o que existe na maioria dos casos são projetos de cidades inteligentes muito específicos, ou de resíduos, tratamento de resíduos, enfim, que soluciona sim um problema, mas está longe de solucionar, ou de estar dentro de um projeto de cidade do futuro, de cidade que pensa o bem-estar, de cidade que quer pensar de forma integrada o papel e a vida do cidadão como centro do processo de transformação. Então, esse é um dado aí que daqui a pouco a gente vai colocar público para todos conhecerem. E aí, por fim, eu vou falar, como eu disse no início da minha fala, bem rapidinho, assim, só para estimular um pouco a discussão. Lá no âmbito da pró-reitoria de pós-graduação em pesquisa, a gente tem feito muita parceria com o Parque Tecnológico nessa área de cidades inteligentes. E uma delas tem relação com o Living Lab do Parque Tecnológico. O Parque Tecnológico ele tem hoje, né, ele já inaugurou o seu Living Lab, mas o Living Lab, esse laboratório livre, ele precisa de quê? De empresas que queiram, né, a solução tecnológica, precisa dos laboratórios que vão oferecer esse conhecimento para testar a tecnologia ou o conhecimento ali no âmbito da UFRJ, no âmbito particularmente do Parque Tecnológico. Então, a Pró-Reitoria de Pós-Graduação em Pesquisa tem feito mapeamento dos laboratórios de pesquisa que têm sinergia com as temáticas de cidades inteligentes nas suas diferentes frentes, e tem tentado mobilizar esses pesquisadores de modo que a gente possa fazer essa integração proativa, propositiva. Já tem por exemplo, agora, nesse momento, a gente tem um grupo pensando particularmente a cidade de Maricá. Pessoal da arquitetura, não sei se está ciente do que está acontecendo lá, da Escola de Belas Artes, com engenharia, de uma maneira integrada, pensando soluções inteligentes para a cidade de Maricá, usando o Living Lab como palco dessa tecnologia. Então, só para vocês saberem disso. Uma outra iniciativa, e aí tem mais a ver com os ODS de uma maneira macro, né? Cidades inteligentes seria um dos eixos mas não o único dos ODS. A Pró-Reitoria de Pós-Graduação e Pesquisa também está relançando seu sistema de laboratórios, em que a gente hoje tem 1.456 laboratórios de pesquisa na UFRJ, sendo, obviamente, que laboratórios no sentido macro do termo, tá? Inclui aí grupos de pesquisa, laboratórios experimentais, etc. O que a gente está fazendo no sistema de modo a mapear todo mundo que estuda ODSs na UFRJ? A gente colocou dentro do nosso sistema um indicador. Você estuda algum tema dos ODS, aí a pessoa vai responder, o coordenador do laboratório vai articular isso com o ODS que ele estuda. Isso tende, e a gente vai fazer um lançamento disso nas próximas 2 semanas, mas isso tende a nos dar um mapa real de como a UFRJ está na Agenda 2030 para poder, inclusive, estimular que a nossa universidade esteja, ou seja, também um ator dentro desse processo de transformação, não só da cidade do Rio de Janeiro, como todo o estado, né, da qual a gente faz parte aqui também, tem Macaé, Duque de Caxias, só para falar onde estamos presentes.
Você já sabe quando vai ser?
O relançamento desse vai ser no dia 20 agora, daqui 2 semanas, a gente vai fazer um evento híbrido na Inovateca. Esse sistema de laboratórios ele é espelhado pelo Conecta UFRJ. Não sei se vocês conhecem, é um sistema que... A ideia desse sistema é ser público, para que o público conheça o UFRJ. Então, ele vai... a ideia é que a gente tenha bastante adesão, de modo que a gente consiga, de fato, mapear. E eu não tenho a menor dúvida de que esses 1.456 laboratórios produzem muita coisa inovadora, mas às vezes a gente se perde dentro da imensidão que é a nossa universidade. Então, acho que tem um potencial enorme, não só de conhecer, mas também de gerar sinergia entre os grupos, e é isso que a gente quer estimular. Enfim, pessoal, eu acho que eram essas as provocações que eu queria fazer. Vamos pensar o ODS 11, obviamente que a cidade está permeada por todos os outros ODS, mas também pensar aí as cidades inteligentes, particularmente na nossa realidade latino-americana, da qual pertencemos e que temos mazelas muito específicas e muito estruturantes para resolver. Obrigada.
Muito obrigada. Importante reflexão da academia sobre essa questão das cidades e da mobilidade. Agora, a professora Antônio Bonetti.
Bom, obrigado a todos, boa tarde. Obrigado, Ana, Renato, pelo convite. Olha, gente, quando eu vi o vídeo, uns 2 ou 3 dias atrás, eu achei muito interessante, comecei a pensar como que eu estruturava aqui uma reflexão. Vocês viram que é uma parte que ali do vídeo que convida a gente a saber mais sobre o projeto. E aí eu cometi o erro de clicar, né? E a partir do volume de informações que eu passei a ter, a cabeça entrou naquele estágio de fervilhar. E que não é um bom momento, né, para você fazer reflexão. Você está, né, em ebulição. Então, e eu vim para cá, eu já tinha combinado, estava ansioso. Né, ontem participei do meu primeiro evento presencial lá na Unicamp. Então, muito animado com isso, vim para cá, né, tratando de acalmar a cabeça e organizar algumas ideias. Né? Depois assisti essa sessão inaugural. Então, de fato, confundiu mais ainda. Então, vou fazer algumas reflexões que provavelmente serão confusas, mas é o que dá para fazer no estado mental que eu estou. Tá? Eu vinha pensando, e a Maria Antonieta, bom, um dos temas da mobilidade, a outra é alimento, que é uma área que eu trabalho. Eu vinha pensando que aqui nós temos um bom exemplo, né, de mudanças que são aparentemente superficiais, que estão em curso, necessárias, e do que seriam mudanças profundas nessa área do alimento. Nós temos, na verdade, já há algum tempo, né, inserido muito a questão ambiental, a questão da demanda da sustentabilidade, a questão de alimentos mais saudáveis, na discussão e até nas próprias políticas de desenvolvimento da agricultura e do agronegócio. São pressões que, de fato, têm impacto, têm tido impacto. Insatisfatórios, mas têm tido impacto. Quando nós comparamos o que era a agricultura brasileira 30 anos atrás com o que é hoje, em termos de práticas agrícolas, sustentabilidade, etc., etc., melhorou muito. Se nós tivéssemos mantido os padrões de 30 anos atrás, nós provavelmente não teríamos mais solos agriculturáveis, porque os anos 70 foram marcados por uma taxa de erosão de solo enorme. Bom, enfim, então essa é a ideia. Mas vejo que essa é uma mudança superficial dentro do conceito que está sendo colocado agora, de transformações mais profundas, mas ainda assim custoso, longe de estar num ritmo, num alcance que a gente deseja, em todos os aspectos. Então a gente reconhece progresso, mas em todos os aspectos nós temos insuficiências, nós temos déficits. Em alguns deles, os progressos, inclusive, são feitos às custas de retrocessos. Por exemplo, a gente fala muito do aumento da produtividade agrícola no Brasil. De fato, é fantástico o aumento da produtividade. Mas o aumento da produtividade, quando a gente vai fazer uma análise fina, está assentado em dois grandes fatores. De fato, a inovação tecnológica, mas também a incorporação de novas áreas e a mudança do uso do solo. Então, isso vem junto, o aumento da mudança de novas áreas, a expansão que continua horizontal e o aumento da produtividade. Toda vez que há uma redução da incorporação de novas áreas, você registra, de fato, uma estagnação da produtividade. É o que está acontecendo, por exemplo, na cana-de-açúcar, que estagnou a evolução da produtividade justamente junto com a estagnação da área plantada. Então você tem isso e você observa que mesmo com a soja em lugares onde você tem uma estagnação do processo de expansão, você tem uma redução do ritmo de aumento da produtividade e uma estabilização da produtividade média. Então, de qualquer maneira, é uma mudança que a gente poderia considerar superficial, mas custosíssima. Eu não tenho dúvida que o estabelecimento agropecuário brasileiro está melhor, está mais sustentável, aquilo que a gente chama da porteira para dentro. Usa melhor os recursos naturais, em média. Mas isto resolve o nosso problema e aponta para uma transformação profunda? Não. Não aponta. E por que não aponta? Porque esse sistema produtivo, ele está organizado para atender uma demanda mundial de produtos agropecuários que tem um padrão que é insustentável. Então, por mais sustentável que venha a ser o estabelecimento agropecuário organizado para produzir soja, para produzir milho, para produzir gado, para produzir proteínas animais, para atender a um padrão de consumo alimentar que se estabeleceu no mundo, ele continuará insustentável do ponto de vista global e do ponto de vista da equidade. Por quê? Porque este padrão alimentar que nós temos e que se consolidou, ele é, de fato, insustentável quando a gente projeta um mundo sem fome, um mundo com as necessidades alimentares atendidas. Então, nesse sentido, ele seria, inclusive, né, um padrão sem nenhuma ética, utilizando aquele conceito de que é ético aquilo que pode ser generalizado de forma mais ou menos igualitária. Então, se nós projetarmos, né, a nossa cesta de consumo de classe média brasileira, argentina, ou americana, ou europeia para o mundo, né, o mundo entra em ebulição porque ele não é absolutamente sustentável. Então, a grande transformação, portanto, nesse caso, seria a transformação do padrão de consumo geral. Essa mudança seria a indutora da grande transformação que levaria, né, com o apoio de tecnologias, etc., tudo que foi comentado aqui, a transformação do sistema produtivo na direção que nós estamos indicando. E aí eu faço a reflexão. Bom, transformação do padrão de consumo alimentar. O que significa isso? Significa coisas que foram mencionadas aqui na primeira palestra, né? Aspirações. Então, quando o Caetano falou, né, dos eixos principais, né, ele falou, olha, então construir novas aspirações. Uma delas é essa ideia da suficiência. Ora, a suficiência exige uma mudança cultural enorme. Né? E é uma mudança cultural que a gente pode talvez observar, né, em algumas populações, em alguns movimentos, em alguns países, mas que não me parece que esteja em curso em grande escala. O que me parece que está em curso em grande escala, a dinâmica de desenvolvimento do mundo e dos países em desenvolvimento, principalmente, é a dinâmica ainda do catching up, é a dinâmica do crescimento, é a dinâmica do desenvolvimento mal entendido, porque, na verdade, nunca tivemos desenvolvimento no sentido que o próprio Furtado colocava, que foi mencionado aqui. Né? Então, temos essa dificuldade. Segundo ponto que eu faria é que a dinâmica que nós estamos vivendo é uma dinâmica que, no lugar de promover consensos, de buscar consensos, é uma dinâmica que é contrária a essa, é uma dinâmica que está se aproveitando dos dissensos, se aproveitando de pontos de vista contrários, né, para promover isso, né, uma divisão, para promover um social divide ainda maior do que o que nós tivemos. Né? Então, aqui tem uma matéria que, de fato, eu não entendo, de ciência política, né? Então estamos num ambiente adequado, é como encaminhar, qual é a perspectiva disso? Quando eu vejo, né, que os processos políticos, os processos culturais, no lugar de estarem, digamos, buscando a construção de mudanças transformadoras, estão explorando exatamente as divisões. E, evidentemente, que isso é provocado, né, por esse movimento da extrema-direita, né, em escala global, porque não é apenas aqui no Brasil, que gera essa divisão, né, e transforma em polêmica até se a Terra é redonda e em vacina. Então, eu acho que o caso da vacina, que o caso da abelha trouxe aqui, foi também colocado, é muito exemplar, né, é muito exemplar, né, como que quando veio a pandemia, nós tivemos aquela expectativa, que foi mais ou menos generalizada, de que a pandemia produziria uma mudança de comportamento, né, num sentido, digamos assim, mais harmônico, mais de uma busca de bem-estar. Foram muitos artigos escritos, nós estamos vendo uma situação onde finalmente nós estamos vendo que o meu bem-estar depende do bem-estar do outro. Isso é positivo, isso vai provocar mudanças. E o que nós vimos foi a exploração, né, política, num sentido tremendamente negativo disso, e que resultou no que resultou, né, na negação por muitos de vacina, do uso de máscara, condenação da própria ciência. E não podemos minimizar a importância disso na medida em que você tem 20%, 25%, 30% da população que aderiu a isso, quando você vê que não é um fenômeno restrito ao Brasil. Então, a minha pergunta aqui, mais do que resposta, não tem nenhuma resposta, é como a gente constrói, né, esses consensos básicos, né, para, digamos, promover essas mudanças culturais, principalmente levando em conta que por trás dos comportamentos existem interesses muito arraigados, né, que essas mudanças culturais implicam perdedores e ganhadores. O Brasil, por exemplo, é um país que claramente seria provavelmente perdedor numa mudança do padrão de consumo alimentar. Não precisa ser perdedor, porque nós teríamos potencial para nos qualificarmos, né, como país, com capacidade produtiva, para inclusive fazer a transição. Mas é uma transição que você não fará sem perdedores em nenhum campo possível. Então aqui, para mim, o grande desafio não é tecnológico, com todo o respeito aos cientistas, é importantíssimo, porque sem a tecnologia nós não teremos condições de promover as mudanças, né? O grande desafio que nós temos aqui é promover uma mudança cultural, né? Promover uma mudança institucional, naquele sentido mais amplo da instituição, como, né, um mindset, como uma maneira de pensar, como uma maneira de se comportar. E aqui eu tenho que fazer coro ao que os meus colegas que me antecederam colocaram, né? Me lembrou muito o artigo do João Moreira Lima, aliás, um artigo maravilhoso, que provavelmente vocês leram, publicado na Piauí, 3 ou 4 artigos fantásticos, arrabalde, onde ele conta, num dos capítulos, que foi o terceiro, a experiência de Paragominas, né? Quando começa uma pressão pela mudança, e essa pressão pela mudança associa, ao mesmo tempo, né, uma mobilização para conscientizar, né, os principais stakeholders, que no caso eram os fazendeiros, que não davam nenhum valor para a floresta. Por que não davam nenhum valor para a floresta? Porque eram todos do sul. A floresta não fazia parte da cultura deles, foram criados já em áreas desmatadas, né, como produtores, como agricultores, e não como, né, cuidadores de uma floresta como é a população originária da Amazônia. Então houve um trabalho de conscientização, que foi difícil de fazer, de convencimento, mas esse trabalho de convencimento foi apoiado por regulação. Regulação que tinha 2 elementos: incentivos e, né, punição. E ele diz em várias entrevistas que em determinados momentos valia a punição. Era o medo da punição, né? Era de fato, né, o custo da punição né, que pesava. Em outros momentos era o incentivo. E o incentivo não era apenas um incentivo econômico, era inclusive um incentivo de reconhecimento da sociedade pelas pessoas estarem aderindo a algo que começava a ser percebido na sociedade como um valor importante, né? Então aqui tem uma lição importante, né, da parte institucional, né? Instituições que funcionem nesse sentido, instituições que, né, alinhem incentivos na direção dessas transformações, mas que tenham, além dos incentivos, né, os mecanismos eficazes de penalização, de punição. Agora, os incentivos não podem se resumir, né, ao incentivo financeiro. Os incentivos têm que ser maiores do que os financeiros. Tem que ser uma valorização, né, da própria sociedade. Então, me remete à ideia dos professores aqui no Brasil e dos professores na Finlândia. Estive na Finlândia 20 anos atrás e conversando, né, sobre a revolução educacional, vários professores falavam, não, aqui começou com o respeito da sociedade, a valorização da sociedade pelo professor. O principal agente de transformação foi o professor, que passou a ser valorizado na sociedade. Então, me remete, né, à valorização que os professores têm na sociedade brasileira. Então, nós precisamos dessa transformação, que é uma transformação muito grande, muito profunda e que não está baseada apenas na tecnologia. Ela é muito mais difícil que a tecnologia. Quando eu falava da área da agricultura, né, eu sempre falava de inovação na agricultura e para pequeno produtor. Eu cheguei a escrever um livro 20 anos atrás sobre isso, inovação tecnológica e agricultura familiar. Eu falava, gente, o problema da agricultura familiar, da inovação, não é um problema de tecnologia. Se fosse um problema de tecnologia, eu até brincava, na época tinha um programa, chama os universitários, que era um desastre. Os universitários davam respostas todas erradas. Eu falava, se fosse um problema de tecnologia, a gente chamava a Embrapa. Mas a Embrapa tinha competência para resolver o problema de tecnologia. É que o problema é de inovação. E inovação vai muito além da tecnologia. Então, aqui, o nosso grande desafio para promover essas grandes transformações não é um problema de tecnologia. É muito maior. É um problema de inovação. E é um problema de inovação institucional e não organizacional. É um problema de promover mudanças culturais profundas que sustentem essas instituições que vão alinhar incentivos numa direção e validar as punições que terão que ser feitas. Mais ou menos isso, gente. Obrigado, Antônio.
Muito obrigada. Eu acho que as duas falas se convergem, né, nessa questão de que tanto as cidades inteligentes vão requerer também uma reflexão e uma mudança cultural, quanto as transformações na agricultura. Eu passo agora para o professor Richard, que vai falar sobre o livro dele. Né?
Antes ele vai falar sobre essa sessão.
Sim. Então, first commenting on this session, and then on your book.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to Anna Zilli for the invitation. I think there's three disadvantages I think I have right now. One is getting rather late in the day. The other, I don't want to repeat myself in terms of saying something about the book and also the session we have later in the week. And third, I have to speak in English, which may probably be a disadvantage more to you than to me, but I apologize for that. I want to talk about finance, obviously, in a second with the book, but let me just respond to some of the things that I've heard so far during the two sessions. And in particular to the first session and the first presentation, where the question of deep transformation was structured, I think, around three ideas. The idea of sustainability, and that's resonated subsequently in a lot of the discussions, what we mean by sustainability, the understanding that technology is not the solution to the sustainability problem, although it's part of the solution. The second issue from the first presentation was the idea that we should do no harm, I think was the term. And I'm not sure about that. I want to do harm. There are people who have benefited significantly over the last 30 or 40 years that will have to see significant changes in their position in society if we're going to address the kinds of problems that we've been talking about. And there are certain sectors of the economy, principally the fuel, the oil industry, the gas industry, the fuel energy sector, that will have to experience harm if we're going to solve the problems that we're talking about. So do no harm is not how I would frame the politics of a deep transformation. And I guess the last point that was made was that we can't repeat the mistakes of the past, and that's clearly the case. There was a discussion about developing countries should no longer think in terms of catching up or leapfrogging. I have to say I'm a catching up kind of guy, because I think for most developing countries, catching up is what they want to do. And the gaps that they face in terms of income, in terms of technology, in terms of public services remain huge, and closing those gaps and catching up with what are considered standards that have become the norm in the advanced world, I think has to be part of any global agenda to deal with the global challenges that we face. Now in the UN, of course, and I think it's come up, we, of course, rely on the Sustainable Development Goals as our point of reference in framing and understanding these challenges. And no one disagrees with the Sustainable Development Goals. The 16 goals, or 17 if you include Goal 17, which is big. But for many countries, 17 goals, 68 targets, 130 indicators, don't tell them any much other than they're failing, because most developing countries do not meet these goals, and they know they can't meet them by 2030. And it's become a source of real frustration, I think, for a lot of developing countries, that endlessly the advanced economies and policymakers in the World Bank and the OECD and the UN constantly refer to these as the basis of the solutions to the problems that we face. And in a way, it's a huge over-sophistication, right? Most people in most countries want more or less the same thing. They want a decent job, they want a decent home, they want that home to be an environment that is safe, both physically and in terms of the immediate environment. They want decent public services, education, health. They want a government that listens to them and responds to their needs. More or less, it's the same everywhere, whether you're in Rio de Janeiro or Reykjavik or Riyadh. It's the same kind of, it's not complicated in that. It's not as complicated. And the SDGs runs the risk of overcomplicating. And I think that's, as someone who advocates for them, as I have to do as a UN official, there's an overcomplication. And I think a lot of developing countries are frustrated because there's no sense of a strategy linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. They don't discuss policies in much of the environment that I frequent. What the policies are, what the trade-offs are, what are the interest groups that are involved in pushing or not pushing for some of these goals. And that lack of strategy, I think, is a serious weakness in that discussion. And behind that, I think, is an unwillingness in much of the international multilateral institutional world to discuss politics and to discuss the role of power in the shaping of policy and the shaping of outcomes. The absence of a discussion of power is palpable if you have to listen to international bureaucrats, and the people who like to promote SDGs don't want to talk about power at all, and that includes, of course, the corporate sector that has gravitated towards SDGs as a useful way of defending their own position, often. So that absence of power, I think, and that the discussion of power is a real weakness in the discussion. There's a kind of strategy that many of my colleagues, I think, instinctively resort to when talking about the SDGs, and it's the idea that we should leave nobody behind. If you go into many discussions at the international level, you can probably guess that within 2 minutes of a discussion of the Sustainable Development Goals, someone will be talking about leaving no one behind. And it's a very poor way of thinking about these challenges. It's a very technocratic way, I think, of thinking about these challenges. That is, the world is doing okay, the world is moving ahead, we have the technologies to deal, but there's the unfortunate people who have, it's like the idea that the super speed train has already left the station, but we kind of forgot some people on the platform. It's unfortunate, but we kind of forgot about them, and we somehow have to get them back onto the carriages somehow. And of course, it's not how the problems of inequality are framed in modern capitalist economy. People are not left behind. Most people are thrown under the bus or thrown onto the tracks. And being thrown onto the tracks is very different experience from being left behind. I can assure you of that. And our unwillingness to talk about the systemic reproduction of inequality and unsustainability is a serious weakness, I think, of the SDG agenda. And I think a lot of the work that we've tried to do, I mean, in a way I try and do it in the book, I guess I'll talk about that in a little bit. The work that some of the UN agencies, that includes ECLAC in Latin America, and I think it includes UNCTAD at a more global level, has always been to try and bring the power dimension into the structuring of particularly relationships between countries, between developed and developing countries in particular, but increasingly the way in which asymmetries in power within countries have consequences for the way in which countries relate to each other in an increasingly interdependent world, but in a world that is very asymmetric and with huge gaps and biases in it, which continue to make it very difficult for developing countries to reach the goals that are implied in the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. And I think the lack of a politics of unequal power relations is a major weakness that we face in framing a credible solutions to the kinds of problems that we're all trying to come to terms with. I'll leave it there.
Eu acho que a conclusão do professor Kozel Wright, ela amarra um pouco essa sessão e também a reflexão da primeira, na medida em que nas duas palestras anteriores nós tivemos os objetivos e o que nos falta e o quanto nos falta, né? E ele está mostrando a impossibilidade de chegar a esses objetivos, né? O que quer dizer, de alguma forma, que nós temos que buscar o nosso próprio caminho. We have to take our way by ourselves, not by the goals of United Nations. Professor Richard Kurzul writes, ele é diretor da divisão de estratégia de globalização e desenvolvimento da UNCTAD. Trabalhou nas Nações Unidas, em Nova York e Genebra. Atualmente é diretor de divisão de estratégias de globalização e desenvolvimento, responsável pela publicação da UNCTAD, The Trade and Development Report. Muito obrigada. Agora eu acho que a gente passa aos comentários, né, aos comentadores da sessão, né, e eu convido então para virem para a mesa Rogério Estudos. Esther Dweck seria outra comentadora.
Pode desligar o.
Você acha que a gente deve ligar 1 minuto para a Esther só para saber?
Eu acho que não vai passar isso.
Não. Mas eu não acho que
Vamos começar então?
Mas ele não vai falar primeiro. O Richard não vai falar primeiro sobre o livro. Eu acho que sim. Are you going to speak about the book first? No? Just a few remarks.
Now it's the moment of the book.
Okay.
So if you could have some word about the book. Yeah.
What's the name?
It's called The Case for a New Bretton Woods. It's not, I mean, it is a book, but it's a very short book, and it's as much a polemic as an attempt to really kind of drill down into the detailed workings of the multilateral system. It's what I would call a constructive polemic. We're not calling for the end of the multilateral institutions that were created at the end of the Second World War. Some people do. Some people believe they are so tainted with their own history and their own failures, which are many, that we need to somehow start again with a new conception of global governance that avoids the mistakes that the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization are responsible for.
Constructive polemic.
Yeah, we're not just out to bash them. We're out to bash them with the idea of making them better. That's what we're trying to do in the book. And it's written with a colleague from Boston University, a colleague of mine from Boston University, from the Global Development Policy Center. Look, very quickly, let me just frame a little bit this. At least from my side, UNCTAD has been criticizing the way in which the multilateral institutions have been evolving over the last 40 years. Those institutions, very crudely, were set up to provide support at the global level for a form of managed capitalism that emerged at the end of the Second World War to avoid the mistakes of the interwar period, the instability and the chaos that was characteristic of particularly the 1930s, and to provide support for those countries to deliver on the full employment and welfare agenda that came out of the wartime experience, but had begun to build in the 1930s, of course, in response to the Great Depression. It was not an agenda that embraced development as an issue, although development was never absent from the discussions in Bretton Woods. It's often believed that these institutions were singularly focused on the problems of rich countries, and that's not completely true. There's a very good book by Eric Helleiner called The Forgotten Origins of Bretton Woods. Helleiner is a political economist who teaches in Canada. And his book shows how important, particularly the relationship between the Roosevelt administration and governments in Latin America in the 1930s actually was to the origins of the international institutions. And so development was never absent from the discussion, certainly, but the way in which those institutions evolved, particularly in the 1950s and the 1960s, moved them away, I think, from some of the concerns, and we argue this in the book, some of the concerns of the New Deal generation in the United States, who were very instrumental in the Bretton Woods agenda, and I would argue a very progressive understanding of the international economic agenda. A lot of that progressive agenda was lost when the New Dealers essentially were forced out of the US government at the end of the Second World War. But there were positives that continued to influence the way in which the international institutions operated. That came to an end in the 1970s. I don't want to go through that story about the way in which the US administration, the Nixon administration, ended the fixed exchange rate system that had been created in Bretton Woods and shifted, and essentially, to cut a long story short, shifted from a form of managed capitalism in the advanced economies to a form of highly financialized capitalism that has been evolving over the last 30 years, and to which the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO have in a way become co-conspirators in not helping to manage capitalism, but rather helping to enable footloose capital, a very footloose and highly concentrated, and in many respects, highly predatory form of capital that has emerged over the last 20 years. So the book is an attempt to say, this is not delivered in terms of the promises it made, in terms of improving the lives. It hasn't even delivered on the one big thing that kind of gave it a certain amount of legitimacy, which was that by liberating finance, the argument was this would be good for business and therefore would be good for investment, which would therefore be good for productivity and therefore would be good for lives and livelihoods in countries at all levels of development, including and in particular the developing world. We argue that sequence has never materialized, and one of the great kind of symbols is that, one of the great trends that underpins that is that while financial assets have proliferated on an incredible scale over the last 30 years, the volume of financial assets in the hundreds of trillions of dollars now is on a phenomenal scale, whereas capital formation, that is investment in the good stuff that we want, including the SDGs, but in factories, in skills, in plant and equipment, that's either been stagnant or declining in just about every country other than China, essentially, including Brazil, of course. And so this disconnect between what we need, and we need a lot more investment, including smart cities, and all these things require a large amount of investment. And this disconnect between that and this financialized world that has evolved over the last 30 years, we think is in part the responsibility of these institutions. And what we want to see, I guess, is partly and what we argue in the book, is that these institutions, to some extent, need to get back to their original purpose and intent. But it's not to go back to 1945, because 1945 had its own problems, particularly with respect to developing countries. And there were huge gaps in the system, even in the 50s and 60s, that have never been properly addressed. One of those is to deal with capital controls. That is, whilst there were capital controls in the heyday of Bretton Woods, they were largely controls on the recipients of capital, not on the senders of capital. And it's very important that you have symmetry. To have an effective system of capital controls, you need both. I think more importantly, we argue that there was never a proper way of handling sovereign debt problems in the Bretton Woods system. And that has become more and more apparent as the volume of debt and levels of indebtedness have grown tremendously across the global economy, across countries, with households, with firms, as well as with governments, and is now becoming a very serious problem, yet again, for developing countries under the consequences of the global financial crisis, the COVID-19 shock, and now the war in Ukraine, to the point that we think the chances of developing countries facing a lost decade this decade, precisely when we're meant to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, is almost impossible to do that. With the levels of indebtedness that many countries now, developing countries now face, it is simply impossible for them to make the investments to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. That's certainly true of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but it's true of a lot of middle income, including in Latin America too, that with the pressures of indebtedness, with the servicing that requires, and their vulnerability to subsequent economic shocks, they simply cannot make the investments that we think are necessary to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. So unless we deal with the debt problem through both restructuring and to some extent through cancellation of debt, then we won't do that. And we don't think that the IMF or the World Bank, because they are themselves creditor institutions, they have skin in the game, are the institutions to deal properly with the debt problem. We need some sort of independent institution to deal with this problem properly. So we make an argument for what we would consider somewhat marginal reforms that can make these institutions do a better job of what they were meant to be doing than they currently are. But we also argue there's a need for some serious reforms, systemic reforms to the system if we're going to provide the stability and resource mobilization, particularly for developing countries, for them to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals or development goals in general. So that's the kind of core of the book. There's a kind of course, and it's what I heard in the discussion today, is the question, well, how do you do this? Right? This is the big political question. You need systemic reforms. The nature of hyperglobalization is such that economic and political power has become highly concentrated over the course of the last 30 years. Discussion, the agriculture is a classic case, but it's true of the pharmaceutical industry. We've seen the problem in the WTO in their inability to respond properly to the COVID-19 shock, their incapacity to waive intellectual property rules to allow countries access to the necessary goods and services to deal with the crisis. Why? Because a large part of modern 21st century capitalism is based upon a kind of rent-seeking culture that needs instruments like intellectual property rules to be able to boost their rents. And so they resist, and they did in the case of the vaccine question in the WTO, they lobbied very, very hard to make sure that developing countries that were pushing for changes in the rules did not get what they wanted. Even when the United States notionally joined that alliance at the WTO, they still couldn't get a waiver of the vaccines, given the power of the pharmaceutical lobby, not only domestically, but also internationally. The financial lobby is even more powerful than the pharmaceutical lobby. And they've had a profoundly distortionary effect, not only on international trade, but also on the way in which these institutions operate. And the only way you can deal, I think, with that is alliances. It's an old idea that goes back to John Kenneth Galbraith. The idea of countervailing power is central to any sort of political alliances that we need to counter the distortions and the abuse that large corporations now impose on the global economy, and that's the difficult challenge we face. I mean, we argue in the book. The book was written between March and July of February 2021, and as a consequence, it has some of perhaps the excessive optimism that some of us felt when Joe Biden seemed to be emulating the Rooseveltian spirit at that moment. I think we were slightly naive in that expectation. But I think that the book kind of reflects. So the notion of a Green New Deal, and what we would argue a global Green New Deal, and the building of political alliances between national governments, between reorganized labor, between civil society, is kind of reflected in our arguments in the book. But I mean, for us at least, we don't think, even though we do need these very large investments in cities, in agriculture, in transport systems, and of course ultimately in moving out of a carbon-based energy system to a renewable-based energy system, require trillions of dollars of new investment. That's true. We don't think there's a shortage of finance in this world. I think the one thing that is not in short supply, actually, I think intelligent politicians are in short supply, but finance is not in short supply. And the mobilization of finance and its correct allocation to the sectors and the countries that need it the most is where the problem lies, not in the ability to actually finance the investments that we need. So we very much, in the end, I think the problem is a political problem as much as it is a technological or technocratic or a financing problem. And I guess that's the message in the book.
Muito obrigada, thank you very much. Nós passamos agora aos comentários com relação ao livro do professor e começamos, pode ser então, a Esther Dweck é uma professora do Instituto de Economia da UFRJ e o professor Rogério estuda Senior Fellow do SEBRE e também de GFCC, que é Global Federation. Tá certo. Ok, então Esther, por favor.
First of all, I apologize for being late, but actually I think it was a little bit in advance in the program because it was supposed to start at 6 o'clock, so I'm sorry for coming in the middle of the talk, Richard, but I'm really glad to be invited to this book session because I think the book is very important. And hearing you, I was not able to read the whole book, but I read some parts of it. I don't know if you probably mentioned that you can buy online, but you can buy the ebook copy, so I did it, and it's very interesting. And I think I totally agree that we are in the case for New Britain, we need this if we want to address all the challenges we have in the global society right now. I think the pandemic only, in some way, fast forward the need for this kind of cooperation, because we saw the powerful of when you have some cooperation internationally, especially in developing a specific thing was vaccines, that we have this international cooperation, so it was the fastest vaccine ever in the world. But in terms of economic, especially in terms of inequalities that are growing, and in the first chapter you put these 3 basic inequalities that I totally agree. They are probably the most important ones right now. And so I think the book is it comes in an important time. And I think all my considerations are more related to what you mentioned at the end, the political capability of having this international cooperation in this specific moment of the world. And I also agree that when Joe Biden was elected, I think the whole world was thinking that maybe we have an opportunity. But my first comment is, Bretton Woods I think the world was able to have a Bretton Woods in that specific historical time, not only because of the consequences of the 30s, as you mentioned, and the Second World War, but also because you have a polarized world. You have the other bloc, let's say. And Bretton Woods in some way was a response from the capitalist bloc to, okay, we need to do something, otherwise the whole world will in some way go to the other side, because they're offering something better in terms for the population in general. So, right now, I think one of the important things that we're looking back specifically now is like we have in terms of geopolitical time, it's a very during the pandemic, we thought, okay, the whole world is united, but we knew that this is not what's going to happen after. And right now we have like this not polarized, something. We have China, Russia, and US. We don't know exactly how they're going to work out. And I think one of the big questions is in this new Bretton Woods, was it going to be the whole world, or is it going to be a separate, like China in one side and the rest in the other side, or Russia and China on one side? And so this is something that I was reading in the book. I didn't read the whole thing, so maybe you will address this. I'm not sure, but it's something that it came to my mind, that how it's going to be in this specific period. How we're going to have the new Bretton, which countries will be the leading one? Of course, if you want to have the part of the environmental challenge, you need the whole world. You cannot take anyone apart, because the environmental challenge is not that one country cannot solve it by itself. So I think this is something that we do need the whole world. So this is how politically can we have all these countries together cooperating, because we know in terms of the hegemonic period, the dispute for the hegemony in the world right now is completely open. So, and I don't think Joe Biden has the power all by himself to have this. So this is something that I was curious about. The second point I think you addressed a lot in the book and also in your talk is how this is going to work for the developing countries, because the multilateral institutions they were created with one purpose, but the way they act, you mentioned this in the book and you mentioned right now, but this is something that I wanted to point out, because we know that IMF did the structural adjustment programs in all the developing countries in the 80s, which in some way it explains part of the problems that most of the developing countries are having, or but increase after the 80s. So we know that how the you mentioned this in the book, but I just wanted to point out to people who did not read this, is how to have this multilateral system that actually works for the whole world and not only for the funding countries, as it did in the first period, let's say. And specific to that, I think the environmental issues are something very keen on that, because when we had in Rio, the Rio 2012, the point that was never that we cannot have an agreement. Who is going to have the effort to have a decarbonization? Who's going to have the biggest effort? But Brazil is trying to say that sustainability has to have the three issues: social, environmental, and economic. And of course, you cannot ask the countries who are very behind in terms of social aspects to have the most effort. So you need to have this in some way balanced in a not equal, but in a, how do you say, equitable, I would say. In order for countries who are able to do the most efforts to do it. So I think this is the main issue. And reading the book, I was thinking about the ECLEC. They have this big push, environmental big push, which is very related to the Green New Deal, the word Green New Deal. And I think they have this scheme, which is very interesting, and I think it relates a lot to the book. Because ECLEC historically has this idea that developing countries have a problem with balance of payment. So they usually have this constraint of balance of payment, which would be like the countries cannot grow as fast as they would like to because they have the balance of payment constraint. And in this new model they're developing, I think in the last 5 or 6 years, they have 3 constraints, which are I think it's very interesting. One is the historical balance of payment constraint, but also an environmental constraint and a social constraint. And their point is the social and the balance of payment constraint is something that one country can, in some way, not totally cannot deal alone itself, but it could do some policies, internal policies that would be able to cope with this. But the third one, which is the environmental, is not possible because you need to have this needs to have a global vision, or at least some kind of cooperation in order to deal with this, which is probably going to be the most important one. It's already one of the most important ones, but in the next few years, it's definitely going to be the most important one, the most important constraint to the economies. So I think their idea is very similar to what we bring in book. And I think this is a schematic way to think. It's very interesting to see because you do need to push this, all of them, in order to have the social, because probably in order to solve the social problems, we need to grow much faster than we are able to. So you need to have some kind of balancing inside each country, but globally, in order to push all these 3, let's say, growth constraints to the same point, so you'll be able to solve all the problems together. So I think the idea that you bring in the book is very similar to that, and it's something that I think we need to push forward. But one point that when you have this schematic, we have this table saying Bretton Woods 1.0 and Bretton Woods 2.0. There's one thing that I would like to, if you could comment on, because one thing that I missed in the second Bretton Woods, and maybe you probably changed it for another thing that I know, is the social programs and welfare, and you probably changed it for equality, integrity, and justice. But I think there still need, especially in countries that don't have any, do not have a welfare state consolidated, you still need to do this, push forward this in order to have a more equitable inside each country. And that's something that I was missing in the Bretton Woods 2.0, so I don't know if you'll be able to comment on that. And I did have a little last comment, but my battery I think shut down. but the main point that I started with, and I'll probably finish with it, just to so I could talk a little bit about that, is this political. You mentioned that you were naive when you write. Not naive. You were in a much more optimistic view when you were writing the book. But I would like to hear more what you think right now, what's happening, and especially in the multilateral. Since you are inside this multilateral system, what is the feeling that you have right now? How is the possibilities of having something like that? And exactly who is going to take part in that? in order to have this new Bretton Woods, especially a new international cooperation, in order to have we'll have a future. Because I agree that if we don't solve the environmental issues, we won't have a future. So that's my main comments.
Can I respond, Rogerio? Because I'll forget otherwise. My brain cells are. And you as a World Bank employee, anyway, you're going to bash me. I know. Just a couple of points. On the origins of Bretton Woods, we do think that the original kind of intent of the Morgenthau's and the Harry Dexter Whites was lost very quickly. They were genuinely inclusive in terms of the countries that they, including Russia, right? I mean, Russia was invited to Bretton Woods, it made a contribution. It was very quick in endorsing the agreement before anybody else, I think. And so, and there was I think there was a genuine inclusive, the international New Dealers had a genuinely inclusive view of multilateralism that was lost very quickly in the politics of the Cold War. I mean, very quickly. But the actual motivation of those people, I think, was very different from what happened soon after and what is now currently taking shape. I mean, for example, Janet Yellen, in a recent statement, Janet Yellen is the US Treasury Secretary, so she's the equivalent of Morgenthau. She's the new Henry Morgenthau. And she had a statement recently to the Atlantic Commission, is it, Rogerio? What, the Atlantic Society. I mean, he's one of the...
The lead.
Yeah, Atlantic, it's like the Brookings, it's like these people, it's one of these...
the Atlantic Council.
The Atlantic Council. And so Yellen, just before the IMF meetings in April, went there to give her view of the reforms of the multilateral system that she was very explicit that the system is not fit for purpose to handle the kind of global problems that we're talking about. And she's a serious person, Janet Yellen. And a lot of what she had to say is actually not bad. But then, of course, she says, but we can only push this forward by talking and including like-minded countries. So it's immediately a segmented kind of multilateralism that you hear now from Washington, which is, in my opinion, the opposite of what Morgenthau and those original architects of the Bretton Woods actually wanted to do. So we would be very critical. I mean, there are parts of Yellen's agenda, including the need to scale up multilateral financing, and that's one of the real challenges in the book. We argue, in a funny way, even though we're very critical of these institutions, we actually argue they need more money, right? I mean, because the scale of the problem that they're having to deal with is such that you need a scaling up of multilateral financing. We don't want the conditionalities that have become attached to that financing. We want them to be much less risk. We want them to be less risk averse than they've been. We want them to cut these ties that have with Wall Street financiers that were at the origins of the early workings of the World Bank. So, I mean, we make a number of proposals that allows for this kind of scaling up, I think, is a necessary part of it. But in terms of the current moment, clearly the war has led to a very insular view of what multilateralism is, and I think we're seeing that in the the book also addresses that the book is not just about finance, it's also about trade and investment and the role of the WTO and the failures of the WTO to embrace a more inclusive and transformative agenda. I mean, I think part of the transformative agenda that we argue for, of course, is the need to increase the fiscal and policy space of developing countries. I'm not sure I would argue that they need a social agenda. I mean, the World Bank thinks it's got a social agenda. It's endlessly talking about gender, inequality, race issues, and now, if you go to a World Bank meeting, you might think you've stumbled into a civil society meeting on occasion. Because this is what they want to talk about, right? So, I mean, we would argue, I would argue that social welfare is best delivered at the national level or the subnational level, and what we need is an international system that provides governments with the space, both fiscal and policy space, to make sure governments can deliver on their welfare commitments. I'm not sure I would argue that these institutions should get into the business of delivering social welfare. Environment is a different one. I think we need more than the World Bank actually to be able to deal with environmental challenges, but on the other issue. So the political moment is not what it, the future ain't what it used to be, as Yogi Berra said, and it's not what it used to be 6 months ago, unfortunately. And that's a very serious worry right now. And the consequences of we can see it in the utter failure, the utter failure of the bank and the fund to deal with the shocks from the Ukraine crisis on developing countries. Because the people who are being, the people in Ukraine are being hit in horrendous ways, obviously, but the damage it is causing to developing countries and the failure of the fund and the bank to respond in a fast and adequate and commensurate manner is quite shocking, I think, right now.
Okay, I think we have three problems here. The first one is that I know Vision for 25 years. I remember that we started talking about the international, the multilateral system. The first day we met, he gave me a ride in his car, and after explaining to me why Bruce Springsteen was not a conservative, because I thought that anybody writing a song called I Was Born in the USA had to be some kind of fascist. Then I realized, of course, I was wrong, but since then we have been kind of agreeing on the topics that Kevin brings to this book. I also met Kevin about 10 years ago, and then finally when I spent 1 year as a visiting scholar at Boston, talking about the evolution of the international monetary system. So Kevin, Richard, and I agree most of the things that are in this very good book. By the way, congratulations, and I recommend everybody to read it. The history is written beautifully. The history is very succinct, but very to the topic, and it's very timely. The points the second problem that I have is that the points that I disagree is what divide us, because he's like me, we're getting a little bit old, has bad memory. I was never an employee of the World Bank. I was an executive director representing 8 developing countries in the chair that was led by Brazil. So my perspective was both from within. First, I was a staff member of the Inter-American Development Bank and the United Nations with Richard. So I knew, I went through this whole phase of what the international, it's not an international civil society meetings at the World Bank and the IMF, it's basically the international public servant society that get together and have that kind of conversation, trying to mimic the international civil society sometimes, right? But it's international public servant meetings that we have there. So I was there in a very, I would say, very privileged moment. And that's what defines the points that I was trying to make, which is pretty close to what Stair just said. Okay, but I want to share a little bit of that perspective with you. So I was a staff member of the United Nations, and then I was at the IDB as an economist, and then I was appointed to be the executive director of the IDB, and then I arrived at the World Bank in 2007 as an executive director of the World Bank, when Wolfowitz was leaving in disgrace. It was an interesting thing to see him leaving in disgrace and all the procedures. But anyways, and right after that, you had the crisis. Okay? I remember we had been having these discussions about how the Bretton Woods institutions have evolved, the reforms. There was a sense of reform fatigue because we have had so many discussions about that, nothing changed. After the crisis, in the beginning of the crisis, I went to the first retreat of the executive directors there that I participated. And in the retreat, I remember there was a very good friend of mine, excellent economist, happened to be at the time the chief economist at the World Bank, that with the guy from the IMF, but I will not mention the names. But anyways, we made the point that the subprime crisis was just going to be a hiccup. And because there was enough liquidity and capacity to overcome the crisis. Being myself a Keynesian and a Minskian, I was terrified. I raised my hand and I made the point, I don't think this is going to stop here. This has frozen the international banking system. Is likely to generate what needs to call that deflation process. And I remember my Italian colleague stood up and said, "You trying to terrorize the board." But nobody could have it. Even I was just trying to be, to show off at that time, but nobody could expect that the bet would be so significant. It was so significant that I think I had also a privilege, and when I was at the IMF, at the meetings of the G20, which was just a ministerial forum, at that time chaired by Minister Guido Mantega. But it was just a ministerial forum. It was, by the way, very boring meeting because everybody would share their policy issues and so on and so on. That was nothing important. Then there was this moment, this strange moment when, what's his name? Hank? Paulson. Hank Paulson, right? He said, his assistants came and said, well, we have to create space here, there's security, and so on. Comes President Bush. And President Bush sits down, and of course, everybody, Minister Guido Mantega had to be the chair, and I was almost going up the walls because everybody moved behind. But the matter of the fact, it was the first time the President of the United States entered the IMF to say the following. The situation, Hank here, I believe in markets. That's what I said, funny. I believe in markets, but Hank here said this is going to be big. That's the same Hank that went to Pelosi and basically nailed to her a Republican Secretary of Treasury coming from the capital market, from Wall Street, nailed to her and said, please give me this money right away because this is going to melt down. And then Bush said, and he convinced me that we have to make this a leaders forum. Okay? So I want to go back to this. Then things went very quickly. We had a meeting of the G20 in Sao Paulo. President Lula at the time was the one chairing that. It was an incredible, being within the World Bank, not just at the governance of the multilateral institution, but also very much linked to the discussions of the IMF. The pace of change was extraordinary. I mean, first the multilateral institutions will push immediately to create liquidity, to fill the need for trade finance, which has disappeared and which is going to block all trade and the global economy, causing major damage to all of them. Everybody was holding hands. China was embracing the United States. Everybody was together there. It was a happy family moving together with policies. Very quickly that changed. Why? Because the United States realized, and that was with Barack Obama, unfortunately, realized that there was an easy way out, which was particularly easy. There's a story about that because President Obama was really concerned with the creation of the BRICS, because the BRICS wanted to was basically a challenge to the governance that survived for so many years in the Bretton Woods institution. So that's the second point that I want to remind you. It's important for the points that I'm going to make. And then the U.S. government realized that through quantitative easing, they had a way out. Immediately, Europe realized with the euro they could have quantitative easing as well. Oh, and of course, China, had all the power that they had to overcome the crisis. So, and it was very quickly restored the reign of the winners. And people, as I say, were not left behind, when the countries were not left behind, they were thrown under the buses, and so on. The truth of the matter, if you look at the history of the Bretton Woods institutions, you're right, Richard. In the beginning, there was this push. The World Bank was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and it was not because it was just a cynical way to say we care about development. It's that because the New Deal made it very clear to the U.S. and the political elite. Remember, Roosevelt was extremely conservative. That the survival of the systems itself required some very dramatic change. And they did the New Deal, and they brought that vision to the World Forum when Roosevelt says, well, we have to share prosperities, at least with the allies and the winners of the future, Japan and so on and so on, if we want to create a bloc that would resist the Soviet Union, which was, by the way, also it had an incredible potential to become, a significant winner at that time. So, coming back to the story, and of course, once the Reconstruction happened, but also once the colonial war started, there was at the same time, kind of the U.S. and say, what do we have to continue this? What do we care about this? Europe was reconstructed pretty well. The other countries were in the sphere of power, but also Europe was really concerned about creating an intermediary for them against the colonial independence and the rights. And I could spend another day talking about the European treaties and agreements that were intermediate through the international, the multilateral systems in order to maintain that kind of link. I wish I could tell you about a little bit of Mali, but it's a long story. So the fact is that it changed because the winners, the big winners of the operational international monetary systems that felt that they were satisfied in the economic and political objectives. There was no big threat to the systems, and of course, whatever happened around that was not that important that would threaten, the own existence. The crisis that came, the debt crisis that came in the 1980s, Brazil was extremely hard. I think that one of the reasons Brazil is suffering today is because of structural adjustment in the 1980s, and we can spend more time on this another time. I'm not so tired. But anyways, so the point that Esther was making for me is critical. If you want to see what multilateral system can emerge and why we would emerge, you have to look at the threats that you have nowadays to the winners, to the traditional winners. The big winners of the last 30 years are the G20. It's China and the United States. This is the big winners. So the European Union in a way, but the big winners and those who really control and have much to lose if the whole systems collapse for some reason other did too. Okay? And by the way, China was a big winner because the United States thought that in order to continue being a winner, it had to allow China, I say that my Chinese friends would go crazy about this. It was the best development aid program in the history of mankind. China, the United States opened up trade, forgot about what is it called, the safeguards, trade safeguards, or whatever you call it, no restrictions whatsoever. Of course, the Chinese elite in a command economy was very much used that in order to create, the catching up and so on. It became, ironically, very much appreciate or treated by some developing countries as a role, without forgetting that this is story of the bilateral relationship between China and the United States is so unique. A hegemonic power open up finance, trade, and investments the way they deal with China is so unique. I used to make the joke with my U.S. colleague that if you did that with Haiti in 30 years would be Switzerland. Let me tell you something. Just the story. There's something called HOPE, which is a treaty between Haiti. I know that story pretty well. HOPE between the United States and Haiti, which allows Haiti to export without tariffs to the United States. The only caveat is that all the inputs had to be produced in Haiti. Now, the main product that they could produce was jeans, which Brazil,
Baseball as well.
Baseball, yeah. Brazil wanted the Vicunha, the Brazilian company, wanted to produce that, and they would come to my office and say, we gotta change this, we have to be pressure about this because they cannot produce cotton of quality in a short period of time. Now, if the United States had introduced HOPE in the same terms that they had introduced the treaties with China, I think Haiti would be in a completely different situation. But anyways, coming back to the point that there are only two big winners. What are the challenges that we're facing out there? The challenges are incredible. The climate inequality is knocking at the door. We just heard today, 37 million Americans are poor nowadays. 1% of the U.S. population control. What was the number? Was that 36% of the wealth? I think it's much more than that nowadays. The social unrest is increasing quite significantly, not only in the United States, within the winners, but also outside. This is also in China. China is facing tremendous political turmoil because of inequality. Climate change is really knocking at the door and becoming a threat. There's a reason why the Biden administration is appointed, but yesterday, what is their wartime action program? He used a wartime program that allows him powers basically to command domestic producers to produce green technology that is going to be necessary to make the energy transition in the United States very, very, very quickly. People say that this is because there's this struggle with China, but the truth is that there is a true concern of the consequence because California is burning. This is what the reality in the United States nowadays. It's not climate change. It's not just hitting. It's not just melting some glaciers somewhere in Chile and other parts of the world. It's the United States. It's burning. So I think the second threat has to do with climate change. Climate change is also increasing transition and physical risks, and this is affecting business. Up to now, the financial sector is the one that is, even though it's talking a lot, is moving slower in that direction. So you have all these mounting threats that probably will be much more intense than what happened in 2009. And this is when I think things will start moving towards the need for a push for a change in the multilateral system. It's not going to be anymore anything like that we saw. Again, Steph said the same. You can never cross the same river. The politicals, there are only two big winners that we have to negotiate. Probably the developing countries, we have to organize around two systems, and those systems are going probably to have to collaborate in order to address those. And I'm saying that and conclude that I love the book. I think that you were too optimistic at that part. I think my experience is that change happens when some big threat impact the winners of the system. And I'm optimistic at the same time, sad to say, that I think we are closer than ever to this kind of threat. And developing countries, and that's just the other experience that one that I want to share from my experience. Well, developing countries have to be prepared. At that time, I remember when we had discussion about changes in governance and the multilateral institution, we did not even understand how we could present a candidate for president of the World Bank. As a matter of fact, we did, and Brazil was the one pushing that. But there was never, we always said that there should be a change in the governance, but we are not prepared to exactly say what changes should be taken and something like that. And that's what we should be prepared for. So, love the book, agree with most of the history. I do think that the ending was a little bit naive, and you go back into this UN kind of approach and say, oh, there's much more that you can do with these institutions. I think you may have missed the point that maybe we are at the brink of a new Bretton Woods that is going to be completely different for anything we have seen, and we have to understand what are the consequences of that for developing countries, how developing countries could benefit from that. I stopped for 20 minutes, so thank you.
Would you like to comment?
I can go through lots of reasons why I'm not confident about Biden, including the fact that he's opened up more public land to oil and gas drilling in 6 months than Donald Trump did in 4 years, which is quite a shocking figure. But the one moment, and there are interesting parallels. The one moment where developing countries seriously got their act together to try and reform the system was in the 1970s with the idea of a new international economic order, where they had a real positive agenda. There was a lot of solidarity within the developing world, partly because the consequences of colonialism or imperialism were still there, tangible for them. And they had a certain amount of economic power because the advanced economies were in their own crisis in the 1970s, both economic and distributional. And the developing world, commodity producers, were in a pretty good position economically, particularly oil producers. So now, and that was the basis in which they pushed hard. We know it, in the end it failed. And it failed because the US got its act together, ultimately, to shift its own economic dynamic in a very different direction. It became less of an industrial, it was less military industrial complex, more finance, knowledge military complex that emerged out of the late 1970s, the Volcker shock, and the early Reagan years. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know. China. I mean, I don't think the United States, in its current political position, has the vision to move in a very different direction from basically business as usual. I don't see any form. Biden's going to be he's going to be a lame duck president in 5 months' time, and he's going to be out of office in almost certainly in 2 years' time, and probably with a Republican in the White House, which means a different kind of agenda altogether. China does its own thing. I mean, this is a trust. We are very supportive of China. They are very supportive of us, including work on greening the Belt and Roads. But China does not provide the basis for leading the South. It's not interested in that project, actually. In no way. China's not interested in leading the South. And that's so when you say we have these two, which I to some extent agree with, Ruggiero, it's a kind of worrying polarization rather than an optimistic. When I look at the politics of those two countries, I don't see a progressive route emerging from either pole, and that's got to be worrying from a when we all believe that global problems require global solutions, and that's true of climate, it's true of inequality, it's true of the food crisis and hunger. That's clear. And so, I mean, there are real reasons to. I do take some I'm not completely pessimistic here. When we first came up with the idea of a global Green New Deal in 2009 with Jose Antonio Jomo in New York for the Copenhagen COP, right? So that was 2009, and we said then, look, this is not. There were notions floating around at that time from UNEP, of all places, of a global Green New Deal, in which the instrument for achieving this was the market. and so we reacted to this saying, look, have you ever read the history of the New Deal? Because if you're going to use the New Deal language, you've got to understand that the market and private finance were not the driving forces behind the New Deal, if anything, the opposite. So if you're going to talk about a global Green New Deal, then you better understand the history and the role of the state, the role of redistribution policies in the original New Deal, because they're all relevant to. So we came up with an alternative global Green New Deal, which we thought would be an appropriate framework for the Copenhagen COP, because everyone's saying this was the COP that would make all the difference. This was a make or break moment, right? That was the make or break moment. And so we came up with this. It has many of the same elements that we talk about in other, we've talked about in our 10 publications in this book. We went to Ban Ki-moon to sell this to him. It was completely uninterested. He was not interested in he was interested in a deal, right? That was typical. And he wanted a song. I remember that he wanted a song for Copenhagen. He was very concerned about having a song for the COP. But he was not interested in a serious discussion of the systemic problems that got us into this mess and the kind of forces and policies that would be required. So the global Green New Deal idea died. 8 years later, on the back of a very vociferous activity by a small number of Congress women, of course, in the United States, you got this whole movement suddenly, really unexpectedly, kind of gaining a lot of traction, building up an international network, as well as trying to some extent, influencing domestic politics. And even though I would argue that's to some extent disappointed over the last 2 years, the fact that you got that kind of activity, burst of activity in a short period of time, with legislative power to some extent, and with new kinds of alliances emerging, is something that we have to take as a positive, because I think that's the kind of energy and drive that will be needed if we're going to move in the kinds of directions that we need to move in. And I don't think the World Bank or the IMF ever, Janet Yellen, to her credit, the US Treasury came out yesterday with a criticism of the World Bank for failing to take the climate, even though they talk about it endlessly, as you know. They came out saying, look, you failed to deal with this problem, you failed to create the resources, you failed to channel them in the right direction. So there's a new discourse, I think, emerging again at the multilateral level. You have it also with regional development banks, which we argue are a very important part of a new international architecture and need to be strengthened. And then you have the one good thing that came out of COVID-19 at the international level was the new issuance of special drawing rights by the IMF, $650 billion of this liquidity into the global economy that was not coming from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was pumping a huge amount of liquidity into the global economy, but it's very strategic. As, Brazil being one of the few developing country central banks with access to Fed swap lines. But it's, the SDRs is a positive, and it's triggered a new discussion about the role of SDRs. Can they be used for development finance, not just for liquidity provisioning? And that's a discussion that we need to push on. And, so there are reasons to be realistic, but there are some elements of optimism, I think, in that realism, despite what I have to say about the current. And the worry, I have a very serious worry that the war in Ukraine, a lot of people argue wars lead to new and hopeful ends. They open up new hopeful opportunities. I find it very difficult to see in the Ukraine war a hopeful ending for the international community, and that's a real worry I have.
Now we can finish the session and pass the
Questions?
questions.
Yeah, questions.
Questions. Okay.
Well, thank you, Richard, for the exposition, and Esther and Roger for their reply or the rebuttal. I have a very direct question first. Is the book available for sale here? Richard?
I'm standing by.
By the internet, okay. I was wondering whether there were books available to buy right now, but okay, I will buy Roger's one.
You never gave me one.
There's a Kindle version of it.
All right.
I bought the Kindle version.
Yeah, Kindle version.
Now, my question, well, I think I'm less optimistic than Roger in terms of having like the external threats bringing the US and China together. I think that the day started here, like the afternoon started with the PET team and Institute for the Future, and ending with the SAGRI team of the prospects of multilateral governance. And I think I see more possible to have two systems, one around the US, another around China, one that will be for the like-minded, the Bretton Woods for the like-minded, and then the Chinese system for the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think that's a dangerous dynamic. But my question is I couldn't read the book. My question is about, you say that you don't want to destroy the Bretton Woods system, you want to rebuild it on its basis. But for instance, if you think about the IMF and its system where those who contribute more financially have more decision power, so what's your view for this governance system that is based on financial contribution to have more equitable and more access for the developing countries? So that's why I'm saying I didn't read the book, probably it's there, but I'd like if you could explain.
Well, I mean, it is a problem. I mean, Ruggiero, as an insider, is better able to explain that. I mean, obviously we need to see a system in which one country doesn't have veto power over everything, which is how it was set up with the United States having veto power. Obviously that has had a profound effect on the issue of special drawing rights, because special drawing rights are allocated on the quota basis, so they haven't gone to countries that need it, right? I mean, the US gets the largest share of special drawing rights, China gets a large share, Europe gets a large share. The countries that need it the most get the least in some respect. And so we're now in a whole debate about how you recycle special drawing rights from those that don't need it to those that need it. And that's been going on for 8 months already, and they haven't come up with a solution yet. Maybe they'll put it into some of the new funds that the IMF, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, has been created. We disapprove of using special drawing rights for that, because the good thing about special drawing rights is that they are not, you don't have policy conditionality attached to them. As soon as you put it into a fund, then the fund comes with conditionality. So, there's a lot, and the fact that everyone still thinks, at least people in the Western world, still thinks that the head of the IMF should come from Europe, and from Europe, and the head of the World Bank should come from the United States. I mean, this is 75 years and we haven't changed. This is the smallest thing that you should be able to change. So there are these real frustrations in which even the smallest changes seem to be quite difficult to make, and I want to be realistic about that. But as I say, I take some solace from the SDR story. I think there's a real discussion going on about the need to shift out of its fixation with the AAA rating for its own bonds. There's a discussion. I mean, the calculations are amazing. I'm sure Rogerio's done them. If you go from a AAA rating to a AA plus rating, you can increase the capital available to the World Bank by hundreds of billions of dollars. These are not massive political obstacles to making the system work more effectively. And so you have to hope that out of the discussions that are now going on, there are signs of the one thing I took from, I was at the IMF meetings in Washington in April, and the most frustrated group of countries at the World Bank is middle-income developing countries, not the least developed countries. And middle income, and that's because they are in a way squeezed. There are ways of dealing with the problems of the poorest countries. The advanced economies have left these institutions a long time ago. So there's this real frustration in middle-income countries. And the thing, at the end of the day, middle-income countries do have political clout. They have more political clout than sub-Saharan Africa. And Rogerio has a vested interest. That we need to mobilize these countries better. We need a G24 that is actually a mobilizing institution, not just a kind of talking shop, which is what it's become, quite frankly. What's partly frustrating, I think, is that there are small changes that could actually make a big difference to their effectiveness as multilateral institutions. And, because they're small, they're doable. Because they're not being done, it's doubly frustrating. But I think there's political momentum within the South for change, and we have to, as in whatever way we can, try and mobilize that frustration in a positive direction. Which is not to say, I still think that big issues around debt require something more than that. And at the end of the day, maybe the advanced economy, I've never fully understood how Italy has not gone bankrupt. It's one of those mysteries to me that Italy is not bankrupt. But it's permanently on the verge of bankruptcy. If things go wrong in Europe over the next 6 months, which they could do, given the situation coming out of the war, then you're going to get major problems within the European periphery. That's going to trigger another round of debate about how you handle debt problems properly, and maybe that's the kind of trigger we need to actually having a serious discussion within the IMF and the World Bank on the debt issue, because they refuse to talk about it right now. Even though they say themselves, this is the biggest problem that we face. We had a meeting with Gopinath when I went to Washington, and we say to them, look, you're saying this is an existential threat to some countries, and what's your solution? Well, maybe we can reinvigorate the debt service suspension initiative of the G20, which issued $10 billion to developing countries in response to the COVID-19 shock, which is pathetic on any criteria. But so I don't know. I'm not sure. It's frustrating. It's really frustrating because, for all my criticisms of these institutions, I don't think it would take a lot to make them at least relevant again. Because they're not relevant. They're not relevant. The Federal Reserve has made the IMF essentially an irrelevant institution. It's irrelevant, except for Sri Lanka, who it's going to screw now. It's going to screw Sri Lanka, basically, because they have no alternative but to go to the IMF and beg for money. But it's not going to solve the systemic problems that we're talking about.
In the end, it goes back to your comments to what we were saying about the SDGs. So it's a power issue. It's a power and political issue more than a technical issue. And that's the frustration, because technically we can come up with better solutions. Yeah. But politically, and the power structure prevents us from doing that. But we need to add in a upper bit.
Look,
let's think about something.
There are elections in big developing countries this year that could make a difference.
Yes, that's good.
Hopefully.
Alguma outra questão?
I'd like to thank first Richard and also the talks before. I'm not an economist. I'm graduated in movie making and I work in an NGO, an environmental and social NGO here in Brazil. And every time I hear about these talks, I hear a little about the energy crisis we're in. And Esther talked about environmental and social constraints, but basically, when you look at growth and GDP, it's strictly interrelated with primary energy consumption. And we are facing a huge energy crisis, mainly accelerated by Ukraine war and all COVID and everything that we're living in right now. Like you said, 6 months ago, the world was completely different. And when I hear all of this, and I see how many constraints we have on an international, national, political level, and when we hear our colleagues saying, no, we need to act local and think globally, but then again, we need shots. We need actually tipping points. And when I heard Caetano say about the Earth shot, I hear a lot about Earth overshoot. Actually, we're going through and way beyond tipping points. And my biggest, question, unrest is, do we have time to actually go through these constraints and actually find a solution? Or should we, I really like the phrase that Dennis Meadows said in 2012 about the fourth review on limits to growth. That he said, that was 2012, right? He said, it's too late for sustainable development. We need to urgently think about small resilient systems. And the NGO that I work, we were trying to experiment through territorial development, small resilient systems, right? In rural areas in Brazil. And my biggest unrest is like what we can actually do and how we can actually move towards this huge, it's like we have this huge problem that we basically don't know how to solve, and the tools that we created till now are not sufficient to actually go through this. And
finish, please.
Sure. So I would really like to hear from you guys who actually experience in an international level all of this. If we can, what can we actually do now towards this?
Thank you.
I just written a paper on energy transition, and I understood very little. I understood a little bit more about energy transition. I became very optimistic about that. When you had the oil shocks in the 70s, you had the shock, but you had no technology in order to make the transition. Now you have the shock, and you have all the technology needed in order. But by the way, congratulations for the resilience work you're doing. I think this is what you need to do. This is spectacular. I don't know your NGO, but let's talk about it here. But what you have all the technology. What is stopping this is the inertia of the power in the energy sector, because the technology is available. What can be done on a macro level? Vote. We have to vote for governments, and that we have to pressure governments to pass legislation to transform fossil fuels into stranded assets. Is it difficult? Yeah, but there are more difficult things that any generation said, well, no, this is very difficult. We should be addressed very quickly. But it's a power struggle. It's voting and getting to pass legislation to ban fossil fuels. And most of the energy industry is already transitioning and becoming, the energy companies are not, oil companies are not just oil companies anymore. The energy companies because they're transition, but they know this is going to happen. And all you have to do is to push more so that the government's pass that legislation. Congratulations.
Would you like some comments?
No, look, I don't, you can't, adaptation is not a solution, right? I mean, if we don't keep temperatures below, what we can pick a number, then we can't adapt, right, to some of these products. So, I mean, it's true that adaptation has been hugely neglected in the UNFCCC process. That's a complaint of developing countries, because developing countries are already experiencing the damage that comes from 1.2 degree rise above pre-industrial levels. They know that 1.5 degrees is coming for sure. We're not going to keep it under 1.5. If we're lucky, we'll keep it under 2. But at 1.5, we don't know the damage that's going to happen, but it's going to be very, very severe. And how we handle that, I'm not sure. My honest opinion, I don't think there are micro solutions to that problem. I think we need macro solutions, which is not to say that adaptation, investing in adaptation, I think needs to increase significantly. That's part of the commitment of the next COP in Egypt. That's going to be a big issue. Adaptation is going to be adaptation financing is going to be the biggest issue at the COP in Egypt in November of this year. And I think it should be. I really think it should be, because it's been neglected for, 30, 20 years. But we have to make this transition. We have to make this energy transition. And I agree with Ruggiero that the technology is there, but the oil sector is not driven by technology; it's driven by profitability. And in that sense, it's not even driven by prices. Everyone says, well, the price of renewables has come down massively, which is true. I mean, the cost of solar panels now is a fraction of what it was 25 years ago. But unless if it's still profitable for oil companies to drill and distribute, they will do it. And the financial, and it's not just oil companies. Oil companies themselves are part of a highly financialized network of investment companies and asset management companies that are investing massively in the oil and gas business. So when Carney comes to Glasgow and says he's got $130 trillion to spend on solving the climate problem, and his Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, you can't believe these people. They don't have first of all, they don't have $130 trillion to throw at this problem. Most of it is locked into housing and real estate, actually, most of that asset. And it's not money that's available to be channeled into more renewable energies over the next 5 years. That's just bullshit, basically. And so we need to tackle this problem of a financial system that is out of control, a private credit creating system that is out of control. And until political figures understand that and come up with solutions to dealing with that part of the problem, it's very difficult. We can't simply argue there's a technological solution to this problem. We have to marry that problem to a systemic biases that really prevent the kind of transition that we're talking about.
Ana, podemos então encerrar.
Você mesmo, encerrar.
Ok.
Você é empoderada para isso.
A gente agradece aqui os que permaneceram ouvindo essas discussões interessantes. Eu acho que foi um dia extremamente rico. A gente agradece aos palestrantes, aos comentadores, e convidamos vocês para as próximas reuniões que vão acontecer nessa semana ligadas ao Rio 2030. Boa noite a todos.
Thank you.